Good morning, and thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate the turnout. We'll follow the usual process for our news conferences. The Auditor General will have a prepared statement of about 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the room. And now I'll turn it over to Auditor General Kim Adair.
Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you for coming. Hopefully my voice is picking up on your mics.
Yep.
This morning I tabled a new audit on funding to universities at the Department of Advanced Education. It's a subject this office audited back in 2015 with 7 recommendations made for improvement. We felt it was time for an update because the university sector has evolved in the 10 years since our last audit. Universities are important to Nova Scotia's economy, and the amount of public money they receive reflects this. Over the last 5 years, Nova Scotia's 10 universities received $2.5 billion in department funding. These post-secondary institutions rely on government, on average, for 1/3 of their annual revenue. At the time of the audit, we found the department was not effectively funding, monitoring, or holding universities accountable for those billions of dollars. The audit found the province gave out $1.9 billion in unrestricted operating grants in the last 5 years. As there are no restrictions on this funding, the universities could freely decide to spend it on areas such as student aid, routine maintenance, staff salaries, or executive compensation. We found the annual allocation of the unrestricted operating grants among the 10 universities is arbitrary and based on a formula from over 25 years ago. In 2015, the government passed the University Accountability and Sustainability Act to promote greater financial accountability. At the time of our audit, we found the department was not effectively holding universities accountable for public funds in the 10 years since the Act became law. As a result, a pattern of year-end deficits and cash flow challenges has continued unchecked for certain universities. Collectively, universities owe $370 million in long-term debt. In May of 2023, the department signaled its concern with the long-term financial sustainability of certain universities. But at the time of our audit, it had not made financial accountability a condition for funding. Last year, the department introduced new bilateral funding agreements to improve accountability, but the 1-year contracts expire at the end of this month. These new agreements include performance targets for portions of the operating grant funding, as well as terms and conditions to hold universities accountable for those funds. The new bilateral agreements, if followed, should improve accountability. Recently, the government has turned its focus and more of its funding toward health education to expand existing nursing and medical programs. Despite this investment, the department does not have a plan to advance health education priorities, and there are no targets in place to assess whether the $277 million in health education funding handed out in the last 5 years will achieve intended outcomes. At this point, it's unclear how many healthcare professionals have been added to the provincial workforce as a result of this funding. There are 11 recommendations stemming from this audit, and the department has agreed to implement all of them. I understand that 3 of them are already complete, and there's a plan in place to begin immediately implementing the rest of them. Considering the significant public funds involved, I'm pleased the department intends to explore and evaluate options for a new university operating grant funding model. As well, I just want to say that my office is aware of new legislation introduced in the House of Assembly in February last month to amend the Act. However, this was not part of the audit as it was outside the audit period, which ended September 30th, 2024. I want to thank my staff for their efforts in producing this report, And also my thanks to the many public servants across government who are key to our ability to do work like this every year.
Ms. Adair, you touched on it a little bit, but I want to get kind of drilled down. This $65 million to boost nursing seats at the universities. What can you tell Nova Scotians, or what, in terms of your audit, what conclusions can you draw about whether or not it actually had the intended outcome?
Right. So there is a section of this annual funding that is geared to various health programs, and you mentioned the 65 million for nursing seats. We examined a sample of those programs, looked at whether or not there were cost estimates to support the amount, whether or not there was a plan in place in terms of how they're going to spend it, whether there are performance measures to make sure the outcomes are achieved, and we found no, there definitely needs to be improvement in that area. So there's a specific recommendation to make sure that that stream of healthcare funding does achieve the intended outcomes.
Right, but at this point, you can't say whether that's made any difference at all.
The department could not say whether it has made any difference.
And how do you see that in terms of value for money?
Well, that is a concern, which is why we've made that recommendation, that they need to be able to make sure it's not just enough to give out the funding and say this is funding earmarked for specific programs in healthcare, whether it's medical seats, nursing seats, or health infrastructure, but you need to be able to demonstrate at the end of the day that they're achieving the intended outcomes.
And do you think you can do that? Is there a way to measure that?
Yes. Nursing seats, for example, it's not just filling the seats, but at the end of the day, are there more nurses? Are those nurses staying in the province and working in our healthcare system? That's an example, but there's various reasons behind the different pieces of healthcare funding.
Hey.
Ms. Adair, what are the current guardrails for operating grants for universities as it exists now?
So our findings on the operating grant was mainly around, can the department demonstrate the amount of the funding provided? Does it make sense? Is there a rationale? And we found that it was arbitrary and based on a model from 25 years ago. And then it's the allocation of the annual amount among the 10 universities that could not be supported. So we've made recommendations around reviewing that funding model for that very reason.
So what rationale did the department give for how they were currently or had been previously allocating that money?
So over 25 years ago, I believe it was based on enrollment and the degree programs and the cost involved in the different degree programs.
Okay. And can you explain how the department could be using the 2015 Act more effectively to hold this money accountable?
Yes, so we found even though it had been in place for 15 years, there are mechanisms in that act in terms of financial monitoring of the universities that they could strengthen and do more. There's also instances where certain universities require additional cash funding, and they are to demonstrate, according to the act, I think it's a stabilization plan. Might not have the term quite right, but they are in turn to demonstrate, okay, we need this cash to help us right now, but this is what we're gonna do to rectify the situation. So we found it's that rectifying the situation piece that was not happening.
Okay. And so based on the amendments that were made to the Act, would this audit support the minister being able to initiate a revitalization plan?
I can't speak to the changes to the act because it's so new and we haven't got into it. Yeah.
Ms. Adair, I'm gonna ask this question badly, so please forgive me.
It's okay.
I don't think anyone would argue against sound fiscal management. But it seems to me that there may be, there is a tension. I don't know how you value a liberal education. And the universities over time have been becoming more geared to corporate grants and that sort of thing. And now, through this auditing process and through increased government control, foreseeing the government looking to put board members on looking to place its own people on university boards and so forth. It seems like the politicalization of universities, and isn't there a value in leaving the universities, giving them more independence than what we're seeing happening?
So again, I don't wanna speak to the bill that's before the House. But I will say it is a delicate balancing act. They are independent academic institutions with their own governance structure between the Board of Governors and the Senate to make decisions about their operations and the degree programs they offer. But on the other hand, they are on average receiving a third of their funding and revenue streams from the department. And we looked at this from the perspective of that just under $500 million a year. Is the department doing its appropriate role in monitoring and funding and looking at the sustainability of the universities?
So
we've never had a Laurentian here. How concerned should Illustrations be about the sustainability of their 10 universities?
Good question. So we did a financial analysis of 5 years of audited financial statements of the 10 universities. One of the things we look at, and there's a chart in the report, is the debt to student ratio. And that shows that there are some of the 10 that are at very close or above the ratio that Laurentian University had when they went for creditor protection. So that's the very thing that if the department is more proactive in the financial monitoring, they can identify those concerns proactively and work with the universities to address them.
So which universities are above the Laurentian debacle?
Well,
What page are we looking at here?
And what is that student to debt ratio?
okay,
or
if
debt
we
to-
can just, hang on a second, I wanna
Sure.
get the chart, or do you want us to
Oh.
answer that afterwards?
Is it page 28, that one?
Page 28, yes.
No, the debt per student. So which ones would fall above the Laurentian model? I'm assuming
So
St.
Laurentian was
FX.
at 12,700, I believe. It's on the previous page.
Okay,
Laurentian was 12,793.
okay.
So Acadia is just under, St. FX is above, King's College is close.
So you're worried about the viability of those institutions?
Well, there are many financial indicators to pay attention to. That is one, and that's what this analysis is. Like, we did an analysis of the audited financial statements, but that's why the recommendation is that the department needs to work with the universities to define what is financial health and sustainability. What does that look like in the New Brunswick or Nova Scotia context? And there are many, many factors to consider, and that is one of them.
And what would others be in a good definition of what that is?
Sorry?
Defining that, other than debt to student ratio, what else should be included?
So we're not that prescriptive in saying exactly what it is, but the analysis that we looked at, and it's good information purposes, like the reported surpluses and deficits. There are a couple that have very healthy surpluses, whereas others have repeated deficits. They have a lot of infrastructure. Collectively, there's just under $1 billion in deferred maintenance. There's $370 million in long-term debt. There are many indicators, and this is just probably a start of the analysis that the department needs to decide how do we measure and compare the 10 universities.
Do you know whether the legislation that's currently before the House was triggered by your report in any way?
I can't say that for sure.
Have you met with the government to talk about this report and the recommendations?
Yes, yeah, we vetted the draft report, numerous iterations, the recommendations. We discussed whether they were reasonable and practical and did they agree with them. As I said, we finished our work around September, so in the report, we're showing that they indicate that 3 of the 11 have already been completed and they're working on the rest.
I have a question as well. I don't know if it was asked already, so I apologize if it was, but, the minister released a statement and they said the audit took place before we could measure the impact of our bilateral agreements. With the agreements in place, most recommendations are already complete or will be completed in the coming months. Do you have any response to that?
So as I said, 3 of them they indicate have been completed. The bilateral agreements were about to expire and they're probably going into a new round of bilateral agreements. So in general, I would say it's a fair statement, but I don't know the specifics of what was behind his comment.
Were you surprised, or how did you react to the fact that they had unspent millions that was just sitting there?
Right, so we do report that the healthcare funding that was given out over the last couple of years, how much of it today is sitting, or at the time of our audit, is still sitting in the bank accounts of the universities. That is a concern, and it was a topic of a previous report that we had, so that's why there's a recommendation around that very thing about, so if it sits in their bank account, who gets the benefit of the interest? Is there cost estimates in the front end to dole out the money as they need it, rather than it being given all up front?
Right, but you had reported that this was a problem 10 years ago, or, no, 4 years
not
ago.
that far.
Anyway,
Yeah.
previously, were you surprised that was still the case?
Well, there's, I think, 120 million sitting in university bank accounts that, it remains to be seen how long it's gonna be sitting there. I guess that's all I would say about that.
That's provincial money though, right?
That's provincial money, yes.
One of the more jarring things you say in the report is that public funds could be used to just top up the salaries of some executives, and you have no idea. Did you find that had happened in any instance? Was there any way for you to tell?
So the biggest portion of the funding is 1.9 billion of the 2.5 over the last 5 years is these unconditional operating grants. And it's the universities that can decide where they spend that money. And it could be on things, as you have just mentioned, but we didn't audit that spending at the university level. Our focus was not on the universities, our focus was on the department and their role in monitoring the use of the money.
Can that be audited though? Can you look at, request an audit of university operating grants and how they were spent?
Well, I think it's now an element of the agreements, the ability to audit, so the department could decide to audit, yes.
And it would be up to the department to decide that, or?
So, I believe so, yes, yeah.
The fact that the government dispersed 140 million just before these bilateral agreements, your thoughts on that?
So that was essentially a timing issue. When we talked through our testing, they had doled out 140 million before they had signed agreements. And it was, I don't know, technical details about refining the final agreement for signature, but the point is, do not hand over 140 million of provincial funds until you have signed agreements. So there's a recommendation around that, so I don't think it's likely to happen again.
Did they, what was the rationale for doing it? It was some sort of technical thing, you say?
Well, there was a 6-week period, so it wasn't like it went for months, and it might have been the availability of the individuals to put their signature, yeah, so.
Is it your opinion, based on this audit, that the 2015 legislation, the act, regarding funding is sufficient to hold universities accountable?
I don't think I'd be comfortable weighing in on that.
Okay.
Yeah, it did have some financial reporting requirements included in it, and requirements when there's cash problems to have a plan to address the cash problems. But is it sufficient? I didn't do that exercise.
And the bilateral agreements and the conditions that they include, that are included as responses to your recommendations, are these bilateral agreements
guess our feeling is the bilateral agreements, if followed, will improve accountability. They're, in our view, better than in the past where they had the 5-year memorandums of understanding. So I would go that far to say that they're an improvement.
If I'm an everyday person just trying to figure out where my kid is gonna go to university, why should I care how the government is, or how the universities are spending that money?
So that's, I think, getting into more of the university operations.
Well, why should I care then why it's important to be able to hold that spending accountable?
So that, I think our focus on this audit was looking at it from the department's perspective, and is the province's investment to the tune of $500 million each and every year well spent, and is it being used in such a way that the universities are financially accountable to the province? So I don't think I can quite answer your question, but that wasn't the objective of this audit.
Is there any sense of how much public funding goes into paying down that long-term debt for universities?
I didn't quite
Paying
hear.
down the university's long-term debt?
There is a chart in the report about that breakdown of the long-term funding by university,
Yeah.
and also what their annual payments are on that debt. So
But we don't know how much public funding goes into paying that debt.
I would say it's all intermingled, the funds, so it's hard to, yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I get that you can't really comment on whether or not the bill before the House kind of solves a lot of this. But have you looked at the bill? Have you you've got no impression whatsoever whether or not this, because obviously the minister's going to say, well, this will fix that.
So I'm not to comment on policy. That's very clear in my Auditor General Act. I'm very much in tune to making sure I stick to my lane. So I'm sorry, I can't answer or comment on that.
Is it a surprise that the operating grant funding to universities has increased so, not really that much over the last 5 years? I mean, it's not keeping up with inflation. Student bursaries have decreased. Is any of this a surprise? To you?
So the amount of the funding is your question,
Yeah.
and that's not for us to decide. That's for the department and the budgeting process of the province to determine the amount. But we do say it's time to revisit the funding model, which would probably include both the amount and the allocation of the 10 universities.
Which hypothetically could increase the amount that universities receive and that student bursaries are awarded as well.
Maybe,
Right?
yeah, we don't comment on that.
Okay. Thank you very much for coming.
Merci.
Good to see you back here in this room, and if you have any comments or feedback about this configuration, let me know. I think it probably is
works.
gonna
Better?
win out,
It works, yeah.
And we'll be back here on April 15th for the follow-up report.
Hats off to whoever did the chart on page 14, that piece of impressionist art with all the colors. That's quite something.